Hello, my beloved demon darlings. I would be happy if you could leave a comment where in the world you are listening from. Thanks. Let's get scared. Road experience. I used to drive a truck in northern Manitoba. If you've ever been up that way, you know how desolate it can get. Miles of dense forest, stretches of flat, straight roads, and nothing but the hum of your engine to keep you company. It's the kind of place where you can drive for hours and barely see another soul. One night, I was heading north along a stretch of road that cuts deep through the bush. The kind of road that feels like it's swallowing you whole. Trees pressing in on both sides, thick and black. No streetlights, no houses, just the occasional rustle of wind through the pines. I'd been driving for a few hours, trying to make good time before stopping for the night. Tyson, my dog, was curled up in the passenger seat, snoring lightly. The sound was comforting, the only thing grounding me in that eerie silence. It was late, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, and I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. The night had that suffocating stillness to it, the kind that makes you feel like the world outside the cab doesn't exist anymore. Suddenly, something caught my eye up ahead. At first, it was just a shadow, a large, hulking shape that moved across the road in the distance. My heart skipped a beat. Whatever it was big. Bigger than anything I'd seen on these roads before. At first, I thought it might be a moose. We get plenty of those out here, and they can appear out of nowhere. But this wasn't like any moose I'd ever seen. It wasn't long and lanky like they are. It was tall, towering really, and wide, just massive. I slowed the truck, my hands tightening on the wheel as I watched the figure disappear into the trees on the other side of the road. Tyson stirred beside me, letting out a soft growl. His ears perked up, eyes locked on the spot where the creature had vanished. As I approached the area where it crossed, the air felt different, heavier. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up, and a chill ran down my spine, despite the fact that it wasn't particularly cold outside. I don't know why, but I slowed down to a crawl, eyes scanning the tree line, half expecting to see the thing staring back at me. But there was nothing, just the whisper of the wind through the trees and the faint echo of my idling engine. I sat there for a moment, heart pounding before pushing the pedal down and moving on. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Tyson wouldn't settle down either. He kept growling low, almost like he could sense something I couldn't. When I finally reached the next town, I pulled into a small truck stop, more out of nerves than needing to stop. The place was empty, just a couple of old rigs parked off to the side. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, staring into the rearview mirror. The road behind me was nothing but a long dark ribbon stretching into the night. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a moose, and it sure as hell wasn't a deer. I'd been driving these roads for years, and I know the wildlife around here. Whatever crossed in front of me that night was something else, something I'd never seen before. A few days later, I was listening to the radio, some local chatter between truckers and tow truck drivers, when one of the guys mentioned seeing something strange on the road. My ears perked up. He described it as a huge dark figure crossing the highway late at night, just like what I saw. He said it was tall, way taller than any moose or elk, and walked on 2 legs. Sounded like he'd seen a damn Sasquatch. He went on to say that he didn't believe in that kind of thing. Not until now. And he didn't want people thinking he was crazy, but he was sure of what he saw. Bigfoot, he called it. I couldn't help but feel a shiver run through me. I wasn't one to believe in those kinds of stories either, but the way that thing moved, the way it just vanished into the trees, it wasn't right. Later on, I had a delivery to make in a small, remote, indigenous community not too far from where I had my encounter. After dropping off the goods, I struck up a conversation with one of the locals, an older guy. We talked about the roads, the wildlife, the usual trucker banter. I mentioned offhand that I'd seen something strange on the road a few nights back. Something big. He gave me a look, one that said he knew exactly what I was talking about. "Ah," he said, nodding slowly. "The elders speak of them, like any other creature in the woods. Been here long before we were." I asked him what he meant, and he just shrugged, like it was no big deal. "Some call them Sasquatch, Bigfoot. We just know they're there. Not animals, but not people either. Just something old, something that's always been." That stuck with me. The way he talked about it so casually, like it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Like it was just another part of the wilderness, like a deer or a wolf. To this day, I still don't know what I saw. I've driven that road countless times since, and I've never seen anything like it again. But every time I pass that spot, I get the same feeling. The hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I can't help but glance at the tree line, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. I don't know if it was Bigfoot. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or maybe I was more tired than I thought. But deep down, I know it wasn't. Whatever I saw that night wasn't just an animal. It was something else. Rest stop horror. I've been hauling freight for over a decade now, and let me tell you, you see some strange things when you spend that much time on the road. Most of it you just brush off as part of the job, but every now and then something happens that you can't shake, something that sticks with you. This is one of those stories. It was about 2 years ago, and I was on a late-night haul through the middle of nowhere. One of those desolate stretches of highway where there's nothing but open fields and dark, empty rest areas for miles. I'd been driving for hours and needed to pull over and get some sleep before my eyes started closing on their own. I spotted a rest area up ahead and decided it was as good a place as any to stop. When I pulled in, the lot was completely empty. Not a single other vehicle in sight. Normally, I like to see at least 1 or 2 cars or trucks parked there. It just feels better knowing you're not alone. But that night, it was just me. I parked my rig near the far end of the lot, shut off the engine, and settled in for a few hours of sleep. The first couple of hours passed uneventfully. It was quiet. Eerily quiet, actually. No crickets, no wind, just the heavy silence of the night. I wasn't used to it being so still, but I figured it was just the isolation of the place. Eventually, I drifted off. Sometime later, I woke up to a sound, faint at first, but growing louder. It was the barking of a dog, far off in the distance. At first, I thought it was my imagination, or maybe a stray wandering around the area. But as the minutes ticked by, the barking got louder and more insistent, like it was moving closer to the truck. I sat up in my seat and rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the grogginess. The barking kept coming, louder now, and it wasn't just the sound of any dog. It was aggressive, almost rabid. The kind of bark that sends a shiver down your spine, the kind that sounds angry. I glanced at the clock, 3:15 a.m. The rest area was still pitch black, and as I peered out the window, I couldn't see a thing. But that barking, it was right outside my door. I turned on the interior lights and reached for the window, expecting to see some stray dogs scratching at the side of the cab. But when I looked out, there was nothing. No dog. No movement. Just the empty parking lot, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights. The barking, though, now it was louder, like whatever it was right underneath me, directly below the driver's side door. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed my flashlight, flicked it on, and cracked open the door. I shined the beam down into the darkness, expecting to find a rabid dog, maybe even a pack of them. But again, nothing. The sound was there, loud and vicious, but there was no source. It was like the barking was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I slammed the door shut and locked it, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Something was wrong. My gut told me to leave, but my mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just an echo, or maybe I was more tired than I realized, and my brain was playing tricks on me. But as I sat there, trying to make sense of it, the barking stopped. Silence. Then I heard something else. A low, guttural growl. Not from a dog. No, this was something else. Something that didn't belong out here in the middle of a quiet rest area. I held my breath and slowly turned toward the passenger side window. At first, I didn't see anything, just the reflection of the cab's interior lights in the glass. But then, something moved. Just a flicker, barely noticeable. I leaned closer to the window, my pulse racing. That's when I saw it, a face, pressed up against the glass, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. It wasn't human, not by any stretch. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and stretched too tight over its bony face. The mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. And the eyes. Those eyes were black, soulless pits. I froze, unable to move, my mind scrambling to process what I was seeing. The thing outside the window just stood there, grinning at me, its breath fogging up the glass. Then it barked. Not a dog's bark, but a twisted, mocking imitation of one. Short, sharp barks, like it was trying to mimic the sound. Each one louder and more frantic than the last, until it was a rapid-fire assault on my senses. I snapped out of it, grabbed the keys, and fired up the engine. Whatever the hell that thing was, I wasn't sticking around to find out. The truck roared to life, and I floored it, tires screeching as I tore out of the rest area and back onto the highway. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up, and even then, I didn't feel safe. I never went back to that rest area again. In fact, I avoid that entire stretch of road whenever possible. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was a hallucination, or maybe something much worse. All I know is that whatever it wasn't just a dog, and it wasn't something I ever want to see again. The woman and the boy. I've been hauling freight for nearly 15 years, and I've seen my share of strange things on the road. Weird shadows, odd lights in the sky, stuff you can usually explain away. But this is something that still sends a chill down my spine whenever I think about it. It was late one summer night around 2 a.m., and I was making my way through a long stretch of interstate out in the middle of nowhere. The kind of highway where the nearest town is over 50 miles away. And the only light you get is from your headlights and the occasional flicker of a passing car. Most nights it's peaceful, even relaxing, just me and the open road. But not this night. The air felt heavy, like a storm was coming, but there were no clouds in the sky. Just a thick, almost oppressive stillness. I had the radio turned off, preferring the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the low rumble of the engine to keep me focused. I was in a bit of a trance, the kind you slip into after hours on the road, when something caught my eye. Up ahead, maybe 200 yards in the distance, I saw two figures walking along the shoulder, a woman and a small boy. They were holding hands, and the boy was clutching something in his free hand, maybe a toy or a stuffed animal, I couldn't tell. But what really stood out was what they were wearing. The woman was in a long, flowing white dress that seemed to glow under my headlights, and the boy wore what looked like an old-fashioned outfit, like something from a different time, suspenders and a little cap, the kind you'd see in old black and white photos. It didn't make sense. There was no reason for anyone to be out here, especially dressed like that, in the middle of the night. At first, I thought maybe they'd broken down and were walking to get help, so I slowed down as I approached. But something didn't feel right. There was something off about the way they moved, slow and deliberate, like they weren't in any hurry at all. And the way the woman held the boy's hand, too tight, almost like she was guiding him somewhere he didn't want to go. I pulled the truck over to the shoulder and rolled to a stop, keeping my eyes on them. They didn't react to the sound of my engine or the screech of my brakes. They just kept walking, heading toward the woods that lined the highway. I honked the horn. Nothing. No reaction. I called out to them, "Hey, do you need help?" The woman stopped. The boy stopped too, but he didn't look up. His head hung low, and his shoulders slumped like he was tired, or sad. She turned her head slowly, just enough for me to see her face in the dim light. Pale, almost sickly. Her eyes. They didn't look right. They were too wide, too dark, like two bottomless pits. She stared at me for what felt like forever, just standing there on the side of the road holding the boy's hand. My heart pounded in my chest. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get back in the truck and leave. But I was frozen, locked in place by that unsettling gaze. Then, without warning, she turned and led the boy into the woods. They didn't run, didn't hurry, just calmly walked into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there for a minute, trying to process what I'd just seen. It didn't make any sense. Why would she walk into the woods with a child at this hour? Who were they? Where did they come from? I grabbed my flashlight, jumped out of the cab, and ran toward the spot where I'd last seen them. My feet crunched on the gravel as I shone the beam into the trees, but there was no sign of them. No footprints, no rustling in the underbrush, just silence. The woods were still, unnaturally so, as if the world itself had been holding its breath. I didn't stick around to figure it out. I backed away, climbed into the truck, and hit the gas. My heart raced, and my hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel tighter than I ever had. I kept glancing in my mirrors, half expecting to see her standing on the shoulder again, those wide, empty eyes watching me. I didn't stop until I reached the next truck stop, miles down the road. I parked under the brightest lights I could find and sat there for a while, trying to shake the feeling that something or someone was still watching me. I've driven that stretch of road a dozen times since, but I've never seen the woman and the boy again. I don't know if they were real or if they were some kind of ghostly echo trapped on that highway. But one thing's for sure. I'll never forget the way she looked at me. Like she knew something I didn't. Something dark. Something that should have stayed hidden in the woods. And now, every time I drive through that area late at night, I keep my eyes straight ahead and my foot on the gas. Because whatever she was, I'm not sure I want to see her again. The man who never stopped walking. I've been driving trucks for over a decade now. You get used to the long, lonely hours on the road, the endless stretches of highway with nothing but your thoughts to keep you company. Nights are the worst, though. Those quiet, empty nights when it feels like the world has forgotten you exist. This story comes from one of those nights, and it's something I'll never forget. It was late, well past midnight, and I'd been hauling cargo across the Midwest for hours. I'd just crossed into a stretch of rural highway, a route I hadn't driven before. The road was dark, lined with thick trees on both sides, and not a single other car in sight. It was one of those nights where you almost feel like you're the last person on Earth. I'd been fighting off fatigue for a while, so when I saw a sign for a way station up ahead, I figured it was as good a time as any to pull over and stretch my legs. The station was a relic, an old refurbished train station, barely lit, sitting just off the tracks that ran parallel to the road. The whole place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The faint light from the building cast long, eerie shadows across the lot. I pulled in, parked the truck, and hopped out. The air was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you feel uneasy. As I stood there, rubbing my hands together for warmth, I noticed something strange. Just beyond the station, walking along the old train tracks, was a man. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was a worker or someone checking on the tracks. But there was something odd about the way he moved. He was slow, deliberate, like he was lost in his own world. In his hand, he carried a lantern, casting a dim, flickering light around him. It was strange. Who carries a lantern in this day and age? I called out to him. "Hey, you okay?" He didn't respond, didn't even turn around. He just kept walking, his lantern swinging gently at his side, the light bouncing off the rails as he moved further down the track. "Hey!" I yelled again, louder this time, thinking maybe he didn't hear me. "You need help or something?" Still nothing. He just kept walking, disappearing into the darkness beyond the station. Now, something didn't sit right with me. There was something about the way he moved, the way he didn't respond, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I decided to head inside the station to let someone know. Maybe the guy needed help. Maybe he was lost or injured. I stepped into the station office, where a guy sat behind the desk, looking like he was half asleep. The place smelled of old wood and grease, and the light inside was just as dim as it was outside. "Hey," I said, trying to shake off the cold. "There's some guy out on the tracks, carrying a lantern. Might be drunk or something. You should check on him." The guy behind the desk didn't even look up at first, just grunted like he'd heard this all before. He finally raised his head, and there was something almost bored in his expression, like this was routine. "Lantern, huh?" he muttered, then pointed to the wall behind him. There, hanging on the wall, was an old black and white photo. A group of rail yard workers, probably taken 70, 80 years ago. The kind of photo you see in places that don't want to let go of the past. The kind that looks more like a ghost than a memory. I stepped closer, squinting at the faded faces in the picture. My blood ran cold when I saw him. Standing right in the middle of the group was the man I'd seen on the tracks. The lantern in his hand, that same far-off look in his eyes. "That him?" the guy at the desk asked, still sounding like he was talking about the weather. I stared at the photo, my heart pounding in my chest. Yeah, that's him." The guy just nodded like it was no big deal, like this happened all the time. "You're not the first. He's been out there a long time. Some folks say he's still working. Others say he's looking for something, or someone. Either way, it's best to leave him be." I felt a cold sweat forming on my forehead. "You're telling me I just saw a ghost?" "Call it what you want," the guy shrugged. "But you're not the only one who's seen him. He shows up from time to time, walking the tracks like he's got somewhere to be. I didn't know what to say. I've never been one to believe in ghosts or any of that supernatural nonsense. I'm a trucker. I deal with the real world, with highways and deliveries, with late nights and long hauls. But this wasn't something I could explain. I glanced back at the door, half expecting to see the man with the lantern standing there, staring at me from the tracks. But there was nothing. I hurried back to my truck, my mind racing. As I fired up the engine and pulled out of the way station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That somewhere, just out of sight, that man with the lantern was still out there, walking the tracks, stuck between this world and whatever comes after. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from that place. But even now, on long, empty stretches of road, I sometimes catch myself glancing at the railroad tracks running parallel to the highway, half expecting to see a flicker of lantern light in the distance. And every time I do, my heart skips a beat, and I remember that cold, eerie night at the way station, and the man who never stopped walking. Something else. I've been driving trucks for close to 20 years now. I've hauled just about everything you can think of, from freight to livestock, across all kinds of terrain. But nothing quite gets the blood pumping like hauling logs down a narrow dirt road in the middle of a dense forest. You're constantly on edge, watching the road, making sure your load stays secure, and hoping nothing goes wrong. But there's one night I'll never forget, something I can't explain. It was late, pushing midnight, and I was on a run deep in the woods. The kind of route where the nearest town is over an hour away and cell reception is non-existent. The only sound was the rumble of the truck engine and the crunch of dirt and gravel under the tires. The road was rough, winding through dense trees that pressed in close on both sides, barely leaving enough room for my rig. I had all my auxiliary lights on, high beams, fog lights, you name it. In a forest this dark, you need all the light you can get. Even with them on, the shadows between the trees seemed endless, like the forest swallowed up the light before it could even touch the ground. I was cruising along, trying to keep my focus sharp, when something caught my eye. Up ahead, right in the middle of the road, there was movement. At first, I thought it was a deer, or maybe a bear, but as I got closer, I realized it was neither. Standing there, in the beam of my headlights, was something else. It was shaped like a man, but its posture was all wrong, hunched over with long arms that hung down past its knees. Its head was wolf-like, with pointed ears and a snout, but far too large to be any wolf I'd ever seen. And the eyes, those glowing amber eyes, locked onto mine through the windshield. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt, my heart hammering in my chest. The thing just stood there, frozen in the middle of the road, staring at me. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, and its muscles rippled beneath the fur like it could tear the truck apart if it wanted to. We sat there, staring at each other for what felt like an eternity. I didn't dare move. My hands were gripping the wheel so tight I could feel my knuckles turning white, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It was like looking into something ancient, something that shouldn't exist. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned. It moved with a speed and grace that didn't make sense for something its size. 1 second it was standing there, and the next it was gone, bolting off into the woods on the other side of the road. I watched as it disappeared into the shadows, the trees swallowing it up until there was no sign it had ever been there. I sat there for a minute, engine idling, trying to process what I'd just seen. My mind was racing, telling me that what I saw couldn't have been real, that it was just a trick of the light, maybe a bear on its hind legs. But I knew better. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. I finally shook myself out of it and pressed the gas, eager to get the hell out of that stretch of road. The rest of the drive was a blur, my eyes constantly darting to the tree line, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me again. When I finally made it to the logging yard and parked the truck, I told a couple of the guys what I saw. Most of them laughed it off, saying I was tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. But a couple of the older guys, the ones who'd been driving these roads for as long as I had, gave each other a look. One of them, a grizzled old-timer named Pete, pulled me aside after the others had wandered off. "You're not the first to see it," he said, his voice low. "And you won't be the last." I stared at him, waiting for him to explain, but he just gave me a grim smile and walked away. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was some kind of creature that lives deep in the woods, something we're not meant to understand. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something out of the old stories people used to tell around campfires to scare each other. Whatever it was, I don't drive that route at night anymore. And every time I'm deep in the forest, hauling logs or otherwise, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Highway horror. I've always preferred driving at night. The roads are quieter, and there's something calming about the open stretch of highway under the stars. But tonight, the calm was shattered. I don't think I'll ever be able to shake what happened. It started like any other run, hauling freight across the Midwest, cutting through back roads and forgotten highways. It was the kind of night where the sky seemed darker than usual, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. Not a car in sight for miles, just the hum of my engine and the soft purr of the road beneath my tires. I had the radio on low, playing an old country tune, and my mind was starting to wander. After hours of driving, fatigue was creeping in around the edges. That kind of tired where you start questioning whether you should pull over for the night or push through until sunrise. That's when it happened. I rounded a bend on a deserted 2-lane road, and out of nowhere, a figure appeared in my headlights. A woman, standing dead center in the road, her eyes wide, her face pale as a ghost, arms outstretched. I slammed the brakes hard. Tires screeched against the asphalt, and my truck lurched forward, shuddering to a stop. The force threw me against the seatbelt, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My hands gripped the wheel, and I stared through the windshield, wide-eyed, breathless. She was gone. I sat there for a second, heart racing, my mind struggling to catch up with what I'd just seen. I was sure I hit her. There was no way I could have stopped in time. I didn't even think I had swerved. She should have been under the truck. Panic surged through me as I threw the truck into park and jumped out of the cab. My boots hit the cold pavement, and I grabbed my flashlight from the side pocket, heart hammering in my chest as I walked to the front of the rig. I half expected to see her crumpled body underneath, broken and bloody, but there was nothing. No blood, no damage, not a single scratch on the front bumper. I scanned the road with my flashlight, sweeping it across the asphalt, expecting to find something, anything, but there wasn't a trace of her. The road was empty. My truck was spotless, like I hadn't even come close to hitting anything at all. I walked further down the road, my boots crunching against the gravel shoulder. The air felt colder than before, and I found myself shivering despite the mild night. My breath came out in puffs of mist. But it wasn't just the temperature. I felt like I was being watched. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding hollow in the stillness. No answer. Just the eerie silence of the night. My flashlight beam swept across the trees lining the road, their bare branches swaying slightly in the wind. Nothing. No sign of the woman. No movement. Not a sound. I stood there for what felt like forever, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? Maybe I was more tired than I realized, my brain playing tricks on me. I had been on the road for hours, and sometimes exhaustion messes with your head. Maybe I hallucinated her. But it felt so real. I felt the impact, the way the truck had jolted when I hit the brakes. And the way she looked, those eyes, wide with terror, staring right at me, like she knew what was about to happen. It didn't feel like a dream. I turned back to the truck, telling myself to shake it off, but just as I reached for the door handle, I heard it, a whisper, barely audible but unmistakable, a voice. "Help me." I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The voice was faint, coming from somewhere behind me, down the road where I'd just been searching. I whipped around, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the night, but there was nothing there. Still, the voice came again, just a little louder this time. "Please, help me." Every instinct screamed at me to get back in the truck and drive. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was fear. Hell, maybe it was some twisted sense of responsibility. I had to know. I had to see if she was real. I started walking back down the road, my heart pounding in my ears. The wind had picked up, rustling through the trees, and I could swear I saw shadows moving just out of the corner of my eye. I kept looking over my shoulder, but no one was there. "Help me," the voice whispered again, this time closer. I stopped dead in my tracks. The beam of my flashlight flickered, then cut out completely, plunging me into darkness. My stomach dropped. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I smacked the flashlight, trying to get it to work again, but it stayed dead. I was standing there in the middle of nowhere, in the pitch black, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow at first, deliberate, like someone was walking through the gravel behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but I couldn't see a thing. The footsteps got closer, louder, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. "Who's there?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. Just the footsteps, closer and closer. I took a step back, bumping into the side of the truck. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but none of it made any sense. My heart was slamming against my chest, adrenaline surging through me. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps stopped. The night went deathly silent again, but I could feel a presence, someone, something, standing right in front of me. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. After what felt like an eternity, I fumbled for the door handle, yanked it open, and scrambled back into the cab, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the wheel. I started the engine, my heart pounding in my chest, and floored it. The truck roared to life, and I sped down the road, not daring to look in the mirrors. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away from there. As I drove, my eyes darted to the side mirror, and for a split second, I saw her, standing at the edge of the road, just outside the reach of my taillights. Her face pale, eyes wide, mouth moving like she was whispering something, and then she was gone. I drove straight through the night, didn't stop until I was hours away from that spot. Even now, I can't explain what happened. Maybe I imagined it, maybe I didn't. I will never know. Never pick up a hitchhiker. I've heard plenty of strange stories out on the road, but I never put much stock in them. You hear all kinds of things when you're a trucker. Ghost sightings, mysterious figures, haunted roads. But after thousands of miles, it all just becomes background noise. That was until I had my own experience. Now, I'm not so sure what to believe. It was late, sometime past midnight, and I was hauling a load through a stretch of desert highway that seemed to stretch on forever. No lights, no other cars, just the dark road ahead and the endless sky above. I was tired, but I was used to long nights behind the wheel. I planned on driving a couple more hours before finding a place to park and get some sleep. That's when I saw him. A figure on the side of the road, his thumb out, standing just beyond the reach of my headlights. It was strange. Who would be out here, miles from anywhere, in the dead of night? But as I got closer, I could see that he was just a young guy, maybe in his 20s. He had a worn backpack slung over one shoulder and looked like he'd been walking for miles. Normally, I wouldn't stop. I've always been told to keep moving, especially at night. You never know what kind of trouble a hitchhiker could bring. But something about this kid looked harmless. Maybe it was the tired look on his face, or the fact that we were so far from civilization. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. The kid climbed up into the passenger seat with a nod of thanks. He was quiet, like he didn't really know what to say, and I didn't push for conversation. We rode in silence for a while, the hum of the engine and the rhythm of the tires on the pavement filling the air. After a few minutes, I asked him where he was headed. He didn't look at me, just stared out the window. "Just up ahead," he said softly. "Not far." His voice was low, almost distant, like he was talking to himself more than to me. I nodded, figuring he didn't want to chat much. The road stretched on, dark and empty, and the weight of the night seemed to press in around us. After a few miles, I noticed a small town coming up on the horizon. It was one of those blink-and-you'll-miss-it places. Just a handful of buildings clustered around a single intersection. He said that's where he needed to be, so I slowed down and pulled into the deserted town. The whole place looked like it had been abandoned years ago. No lights, no people, just a couple of run-down houses and an old gas station. I turned to tell him we were there, but when I glanced at the passenger seat, he was gone. The seatbelt was still buckled, and the door was closed. There was no way he could have gotten out without me noticing. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing, and turned around in my seat to look in the back of the cab. Empty. I sat there for a minute, trying to make sense of it. I'd picked him up, hadn't I? I wasn't imagining it. The kid had been sitting right there, no more than 5 minutes ago. I got out of the truck, my boots crunching on the gravel of the empty street, and looked around. Nothing. The night was silent, the town dead. I walked around the truck, my flashlight scanning the road and the surrounding area. No tracks, no signs of life. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. Shaken, I climbed back into the cab and locked the doors. I sat there for a few moments, staring at the passenger seat, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I told myself I was tired, that maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I didn't waste any more time in that town. I fired up the engine and drove off, leaving the empty streets behind me. As I sped down the highway, I couldn't help but glance at the passenger seat, half expecting to see him sitting there again, staring out the window with that distant look in his eyes. A few miles down the road, I passed an old weathered sign on the side of the highway. It was so faded that I almost missed it, but I managed to catch a glimpse of the words. It was a memorial, dedicated to a young man who had been hit by a car while walking along the highway late one night. The date on the sign was from decades ago. I don't know what I picked up that night, or if I even really picked up anyone at all. But every time I drive through that stretch of desert, I keep my eyes on the road, and I never stop for hitchhikers. Not anymore. Because some things, once they're gone, don't stay gone. Haunting road experience. I'd been on the road for 3 straight days, pushing through long stretches of highway, counting the hours until I could head home for the weekend. My Kenworth with the super sleeper was more than a truck. It was my second home, complete with all the comforts I could need. Tonight, I planned to put it to good use. After finishing up my last delivery, I stocked up on some snacks and a 6-pack of beer. I knew exactly where I was going to park for the night, out in the middle of the desert. There was this one spot off Route 50, sometimes called the loneliest road in America. No lights, no traffic, just quiet solitude. Perfect. Frank, my French bulldog, was already curled up in the passenger seat, snoring softly as we cruised down the empty highway. He was my constant companion on the road, and having him around made those long hauls a little less lonely. We were about 20 miles from the spot when I realized I hadn't seen another car for hours. Just the road ahead and the stars above. I pulled off onto a dirt path, finding a flat, quiet place where I could park for the night. The desert stretched out for miles around, a vast sea of nothingness. I killed the engine, and the silence settled in, thick and still. "All right, Frank, time to chill," I muttered, grabbing the snacks and beer from the fridge in the sleeper. Frank hopped down from the seat and followed me into the back, wagging his little stump of a tail. I kicked off my boots, popped open a beer, and settled into the cozy nook of my sleeper. It was more like a tiny home than a truck. Bed, TV, even a mini kitchen and a shower. I flipped on an old movie and let myself relax. After days on the road, this was exactly what I needed. Frank was stretched out at my feet, but I noticed his ears twitching, like he heard something outside. Probably just the wind, I thought. Out here, the desert could play tricks on you, wind sweeping through the brush, making it sound like someone was creeping around. A couple of beers in, and my eyelids were getting heavy. The hum of the TV mixed with the sound of Frank's soft breathing, and I started to drift off. That's when Frank let out a low growl. I blinked, sitting up a little. He was staring at the door, his body tense, his lips pulled back to show his tiny teeth. "What is it, boy?" I muttered, leaning over to rub his back. Probably just a coyote or some other animal sniffing around the truck. We were in the middle of the desert after all. Frank growled again, this time louder. His little body was rigid and his eyes were locked on the door. I grabbed the remote, paused the movie, and listened. The only sound was the faint whistle of the wind outside. "Come on, buddy, it's just an animal," I said, though I didn't sound so sure. Something about the way Frank was acting made my skin crawl. For a few minutes we sat there in silence. I waited for him to calm down, but he wouldn't stop growling. His eyes never left the door, like he was expecting something. That's when I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. Someone, or something, was knocking on the door of my truck. My heart skipped a beat. We were out in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. I hadn't heard a single car all night. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. Frank's growl deepened, a low rumble in his chest. I slowly got up, my pulse racing. Maybe someone had broken down, needed help. But that didn't explain how they got here. No one would walk this far in the desert without a vehicle. I moved to the front of the cab and peered out the window, expecting to see someone standing there. But all I saw was darkness. The faint glow of the moon barely illuminated the desert, casting long shadows across the ground. There was no one there. Knock. 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 The sound came again, this time louder, more insistent. My blood ran cold. It was coming from the passenger side door now, like whoever, or whatever it was, had moved. But I hadn't seen anyone walk around the truck. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response, just silence. I grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment, hands trembling as I flicked it on. Frank was still growling, his eyes wide, never leaving the door. I hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door and slowly cracking it open. The cold desert air hit me, but there was no one there. I shined the flashlight across the ground, scanning the area around the truck. Nothing. Not a footprint, not a shadow, just empty desert stretching into the darkness. I was about to climb back in when I heard a faint whisper, so soft I almost didn't catch it. "Let me in." I froze. My skin prickled with fear as I scanned the darkness again. But there was still no one. Frank started barking, a high-pitched frantic sound that I'd never heard from him before. I slammed the door shut, locking it, and backed away, heart pounding in my chest. The knocking started again, louder this time, as if whoever was out there was desperate to get inside. The sound moved around the truck, knocking on different spots: the driver's side, the back, the roof. I bolted to the sleeper, grabbed a gun I kept under the bed, and held it tight, my back against the wall. Frank was barking like crazy now, his tiny body trembling. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, everything went deathly still. The only sound was Frank's rapid panting and the pounding of my own heart. Then, from outside, I heard the whisper again, this time right against the door. "Let me in." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there, gripping my gun, waiting for the next knock or whisper. But it never came. After what felt like hours, the desert was silent again. I didn't sleep that night. Frank and I stayed in the sleeper, huddled together, eyes on the door. When the first light of dawn broke, I finally dared to look outside. There was no one there. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been near the truck. I started the engine, pulled out of that spot, and drove straight home without looking back. Whatever was out there in the desert that night, whoever it wasn't human. And I sure as hell wasn't sticking around to find out what it wanted. Terrifying experience. I've been driving trucks long enough to know the stories. The kind of tales that get passed around at truck stops, told over coffee and cigarettes when the miles behind you start to blur together with the ones ahead. Most of them are just that, stories. But every once in a while, something happens out there on the road that makes you wonder how much of it is real. This is one of those stories, and it happened to me. I was on a long haul through the Midwest, running late as usual. I'd planned to stop earlier, but the schedule was tight, and I needed to push through a few more hours before getting some sleep. It was the dead of night, and the road was empty, just me and the endless stretch of asphalt lined with dark fields and the occasional clump of trees. I spotted a small cemetery on the side of the road, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen a visitor in years. The moonlight barely touched the gravestones, casting long, jagged shadows over the earth. I thought about the stories I'd heard, warnings about never parking too close to graveyards. But I shrugged it off. I wasn't one to believe in that sort of thing. A few miles past the cemetery, I pulled over on the shoulder. The road was quiet, no other cars for miles. I figured it was as good a place as any to get a few hours of shut-eye. I locked the doors, reclined in the driver's seat, and settled in for some rest. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I was jolted awake by a loud bang on the side of the truck. I shot up, heart pounding, trying to get my bearings. The cab shook, like someone was pounding on the metal with all their strength. At first, I thought it might be a storm, but the night outside was calm. No wind, no rain. Then came another bang, louder this time, followed by more. It sounded like fists slamming into the side of the truck, one after the other. The entire cab rattled with each hit. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the grogginess. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of nowhere banging on my truck? I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the windows, but all I saw was darkness. I checked the mirrors, nothing. No cars, no people, not even a sign of movement. Another bang. This time it came from the other side of the truck, like something, or someone, was circling me, hitting the metal with a force that made my stomach twist. I yelled out, "Who's there?" But there was no answer, just the eerie silence of the night, interrupted by the pounding against the steel. I flicked on the headlights and stepped out of the truck, the cold air hitting me like a slap to the face. My flashlight beam swept over the empty road and the fields beyond, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone, no cars, no movement. The ground was undisturbed, not a single footprint in the dirt or gravel around the truck. I did a slow circle around the rig, half expecting to find someone hiding in the shadows. But there was no one. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and my gut told me to get the hell out of there. But I couldn't leave without figuring out what was happening. I've always been the kind of guy who needs answers, no matter how unsettling they might be. I climbed back into the cab, locked the doors again, and sat there in the darkness, trying to think. Then, without warning, the banging started again. This time it was coming from the roof. The sound was so loud it made my chest tighten. I stared up at the ceiling of the cab, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually the banging stopped as abruptly as it had started. I waited in the silence, listening for any sign that it might start again. But there was nothing, just the low hum of the engine and the soft rustle of the wind outside. After what felt like an eternity, I decided I'd had enough. Whatever was out there, or whatever had been banging on my truck, wasn't something I wanted to stick around and figure out. I fired up the engine, threw the truck into gear, and peeled off down the road, leaving the eerie stretch of highway and the distant cemetery far behind. I didn't stop driving until the sun started to rise, and by then I was miles away from that cursed place. I pulled into a truck stop, my hands still shaking, and parked in a lot filled with other trucks and drivers. For the first time in hours, I felt a sense of relief. I never figured out what happened that night. Maybe it was some local messing with me. Maybe it was an animal. Or maybe it was something else. Something I don't even want to think about. But I do know one thing. I'll never park near a cemetery again. Some roads hold memories of the dead, and sometimes they don't want to be forgotten. Not an animal. It was just another long-haul drive. I've been a trucker for over 20 years, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the road can play tricks on you, especially at night. But what happened to me on that lonely stretch of highway wasn't a trick. It was something else, something I still can't explain. It was around 2:30 in the morning, and I was deep into one of my regular routes, driving through a desolate patch of highway out in the middle of nowhere. No cars, no gas stations, just miles and miles of asphalt cutting through the dark. I was wide awake, cruising at a steady speed, my headlights illuminating the empty road ahead. There was something calming about the silence of the open road, the hum of the engine keeping me company. As I rounded a bend, my CB radio crackled, a burst of static cutting through the silence. I adjusted the dial, thinking it was just interference, but no one came through. The static died down, and I settled back into my seat, my eyes glued to the road. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a deer standing in the middle of the highway, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't any animal I'd ever seen before. It stood on two legs, its body unnaturally tall and thin, almost like a person, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head too small, and its skin, if you could even call it skin, looked pale and leathery, almost translucent in the glow of my headlights. I hit the brakes hard, my tires screeching against the pavement, but this thing didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me with these deep, hollow eyes, like it was waiting for me. I honked my horn, hoping it would run off, but it didn't even flinch. The closer I got, the more I could feel this weight in the air, like the atmosphere had changed. The temperature inside the cab dropped, and I could see my breath fogging up the windshield. I can't explain it, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like I had just rolled up on something I wasn't supposed to see. I stopped the truck completely, about 20 feet away from this thing. My headlights were on full blast, lighting it up as it just stood there, unmoving. I was frozen, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around, to get the hell out of there. But I couldn't. I couldn't stop staring at it. Then it moved. Not like a normal animal or person. It shifted, almost gliding to the side, its body bending in ways that didn't make sense. It didn't walk. It slithered, its legs dragging behind as it slowly moved off the road and into the trees. I watched it disappear into the darkness, the thick forest swallowing it up. For a moment, I just sat there, my heart pounding in my chest. I thought about calling it in, maybe warning other drivers, but I knew no one would believe me. Hell, I didn't believe me. I even thought about turning back, but that wasn't an option. I had to keep going. As I eased the truck back into gear and slowly drove past the spot where the thing had been standing, I felt a presence, like something was watching me. I glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting to see that creature lurking in the distance, but there was nothing, just the empty road stretching behind me. For the rest of the drive, the feeling of being watched never left me. I kept looking over my shoulder, checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that thing chasing after me in the darkness. Every sound, every rustle of wind outside set my nerves on edge. The radio was silent, no static, no voices. Just the hum of the engine and the unsettling quiet that hung in the air. I've driven that road 100 times before and never saw anything like that. But now, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting. I haven't told anyone about what happened that night. Not my family, not my buddies at the depot. Who would believe me? But every time I passed that stretch of highway, I slow down, my eyes scanning the road and the tree line. And every time, I swear I can feel that thing watching, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to step back into the road. The haunting handprint. I've been a trucker for most of my life, driving long hours across empty highways at night, where the only company is the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the CB radio. Over the years, I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road, but nothing prepared me for what happened on a cold November night, somewhere out in the middle of Nevada. I was hauling a load of auto parts, headed through a stretch of desert highway that seemed to stretch on forever. No streetlights, no cars, just miles of pitch black night ahead. The stars were out, but the moon was just a sliver, barely enough to light up the vast barren land around me. It must have been around 3 a.m., and I was starting to feel that familiar haze creep over me, the kind that only hits when you've been on the road too long and your brain starts playing tricks. I turned up the radio to fight the drowsiness, but even that wasn't helping much. The road felt endless. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement up ahead, maybe 100 yards or so. My headlights caught the outline of something moving across the road, too quick to get a good look. I thought it was a coyote or maybe a stray dog. Happens all the time out in the desert. But as I got closer, I realized this wasn't any animal I'd ever seen. It was tall, much taller than any animal should be, and it moved on 2 legs, not running, but walking with this slow, deliberate pace, like it wasn't in any rush. My heart started pounding as I got closer. I slammed on the brakes, slowing the truck down just as my headlights illuminated the figure fully. It was standing in the middle of the road, facing me. The thing was thin, almost skeletal, with long, gangly limbs that seemed too stretched out to be human. Its skin, or what I could see of it, was pale, almost grey, and covered in something like dirt or grime. But what really got me were its eyes. They were pitch black, like 2 bottomless pits, and they were locked right on me. I couldn't move. I just sat there in the cab, gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing added up. This thing, whatever it was, didn't belong out there. Hell, it didn't belong anywhere. I honked my horn, trying to scare it off, but it didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me, like it was sizing me up. That's when I noticed its mouth. It was too wide, stretching across its face in this grotesque grin. I swear I saw it twitch, like it was about to laugh. I don't know what came over me, but I floored it. My truck roared forward, and just as I was about to hit it, the thing vanished. 1 second it was standing there, and the next, it was gone, like it had melted into the darkness. I sped through the spot where it had been, my heart pounding in my chest, eyes darting to the mirrors, expecting to see it behind me. But the road was empty. For the next hour, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air in the cab felt thick, heavy. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see those black eyes staring back at me. My knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel, but I wasn't stopping. Not until I reached the next town. Finally, I pulled into a small truck stop on the edge of a nowhere town. The place was practically deserted. Just a couple of other rigs parked outside, and an old gas station with flickering lights. I parked my truck, cut the engine, and sat there for a minute, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't stop replaying what I'd seen. I got out of the truck, the cold desert air hitting me like a slap. As I walked toward the gas station, I glanced back at my truck, and my heart nearly stopped. There, on the passenger side window, was a handprint, long thin fingers smeared across the glass. But here's the thing. I never stopped after that thing disappeared. There was no way anyone, or anything, could have touched my truck without me knowing. I stared at that handprint for what felt like forever, my mind racing. I haven't told my buddies on the road about that night. Who would believe me? But every time I drive through that stretch of highway, I keep my eyes peeled, wondering if it'll show up again. And sometimes, late at night, when the road is quiet, I swear I can feel those eyes on me. The fog. It was a late September night, and I had been driving for hours through some back roads, trying to make good time on a run through the mountains. It's not unusual for things to get a little eerie out there. Empty roads, long stretches of darkness, and the occasional unsettling feeling that you're the only person for miles. But nothing I'd experienced before compared to what happened that night. I was about halfway through my route when the fog rolled in. At first, it was just a light mist, nothing too bad. I figured it would pass, like it usually does. But the farther I drove, the thicker it got. Soon, it was so dense I could barely see a few meters in front of me. My headlights just bounced back at me, turning the fog into a glowing white wall. I slowed down, gripping the wheel tight, trying to focus. The road was winding, narrow, with steep drops off to the sides, and the last thing I needed was to end up in a ditch or worse. After a few more minutes of creeping forward, it became clear I wasn't going anywhere fast. The fog was relentless. I decided it was best to pull off to the side and wait it out. Hopefully, it would lift soon and I could get back on my way. I pulled over, put the truck in park, and killed the engine. Silence. I leaned back in my seat and checked the time, just past midnight. I sighed, the kind of tired that settles deep into your bones, and closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine. Then, a movement caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just the fog playing tricks on me, swirling and shifting in the beams of the headlights. But then I saw them. 3 figures, barely visible in the mist, slowly making their way toward the truck. I sat up, heart pounding, and squinted through the windshield, trying to make out what I was seeing. The figures were human-shaped, but their movements were slow, deliberate, almost unnatural. They seemed to be gliding more than walking, and as they got closer, I realized I couldn't hear any footsteps. No crunching gravel, no shuffling leaves, just the oppressive silence of the fog. I flicked on the high beams, hoping for a better look, but the light only made things worse. The fog thickened, swallowing the beams, and the figures became nothing more than shadows moving through a sea of white. I reached for the door handle, my instincts telling me to get out, to confront whoever or whatever was out there. But something in the back of my mind stopped me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a cold chill running down my spine. This didn't feel right. I stayed put. The figures came closer. 3 of them, side by side, shrouded in fog, their faces still obscured. I stared, trying to make sense of it. Was this some kind of prank? A bunch of kids messing around out here in the middle of nowhere? But why would they be out here, miles from any town, in the dead of night? Then they stopped. They stood about 10 meters from the truck, just outside the range of the lights. I could barely make out their features now. Tall, thin, wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothes. Long coats or cloaks, maybe. Something that didn't belong in this century. I waited, breath held, hoping they would move on. But they just stood there, motionless, staring at the truck. And then slowly, the figure in the center stepped forward. I could see it more clearly now. Its face, or what should have been its face, was pale, almost featureless. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, greyish skin stretched tight over a skull-like shape. It tilted its head, like it was watching me, though I couldn't see how. I felt a wave of nausea, and my hand instinctively went to the keys in the ignition. I needed to get out of there, fog or not. But just as I was about to turn the key, the figure raised its hand. It waved. That simple gesture, something so normal, so human, felt wrong. It didn't belong out here in the middle of this nightmare. The figure's arm moved in slow, jerky motions, like it wasn't used to its own body. I started the engine, the roar of the truck breaking the heavy silence. But the figures didn't move. The one in the center kept waving, that hollow face fixed on me. I slammed the truck into gear and floored it. The tires spun on the gravel for a second before catching, and I tore out of there, the fog closing in behind me like a living thing. My heart was racing, hands shaking on the wheel as I sped down the road, not caring about the turns or the fog anymore, just trying to get as far away from that place as possible. I didn't stop until I hit the next town, a good 30 miles down the road. The fog had lifted by then, but I could still feel the chill in my bones. I pulled into a diner's parking lot and sat there for a while, trying to calm down, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget the way that thing waved at me like it was saying goodbye. Or worse, inviting me to follow. Hope you enjoyed the fright. Bloody subscribe to avoid the horrors lurking in the night. Sweet dreams.